Far Cry 5 would be great if it just wasn't a Far Cry game. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the White Collar Player's final words on Far Cry 5. We recently completed a playthrough covering the entirety of the main story and many side missions in Hope County. Being longtime fans of the Far Cry series, we were thrilled to experience the latest iteration of the games and would like to give our opinion on our experience with Ubisoft's latest take on Far Cry, and specifically compare it to the previous titles. Normally, we don't like to compare one game to another, but in the cases where they are of the same title and come from the same producer, a comparison becomes almost necessary. We thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy our breakdown of Far Cry 5. But before we dive in, let us first warn you of spoilers for Far Cry 5, which is obvious, but also discuss the stories of Far Cry 2, 3, and 4, so watch out for spoilers there as well. Regardless of the means, the general premise for each of the previous Far Cry games sees the protagonist falling from grace, sometimes literally, and becoming isolated in a hostile environment far removed from the saving outreach of civilization. Far Cry 2 established this premise early and strongly. You are told in the first cutscene of the game that there are no more planes flying out of the country. Moments later, the town that seems like it might provide security in the harsh African wilderness gets sacked by guerrillas, and the very antagonist you are sent to hunt comes within inches of killing you. The first few hours of Far Cry 2 play out like a survival game as you are trying to escape from the crossfire of a civil conflict, and with literally no other means of communication save a cell phone, which we will assume only operates on local antennas, you are forced to rely on the few friendly people you meet to complete your mission and try to leave the war-torn country. Far Cry 5 attempts to establish this same premise, but it falls very short of creating that feeling of true isolation that the previous games are known for. While having your helicopter crash and a crazy cult chase after you on your way to safety certainly seem like excellent starting points, the entire notion of isolation from civilization was doomed from the start. Setting Far Cry 5 in the interior of America was certainly an interesting choice for Ubisoft, and definitely made for some beautiful scenes. However, nobody even slightly familiar with America as a country would buy into the plot that Far Cry 5 tries to sell. It is absolutely absurd to believe that a modern America would send only 2 US Marshals and a couple local sheriffs to address a growing radicalized cult that had amassed attack helicopters and fighter planes. Much less was occupying abandoned missile silos, which leads us into the next problem with Far Cry 5, the protagonist itself. Continuing to use Far Cry 2 as an example, the game ensured that the protagonist never once felt like an all-powerful or chosen one type character. There is no leveling up, no perks, no special abilities, simply a man who found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. While it gets many critiques, the malaria mechanic, which constantly plagues the protagonist, reinforces this idea. No matter how hard you try, how many people you fight, how much money you earn, you are still a human susceptible to even the smallest threats. No amount of experience and progression can take that away. It serves as a constant reminder that the land you're in is foreign and hostile, and will fight against you no matter what faction you decide to work for. Far Cry 5 completely ignored that concept. There was absolutely no attempt to make the protagonist feel like just another whitetail militia member or a US Marshal who happened to be assigned the wrong case that day. Right out of the gate, the player is given access to bomber planes, assault helicopters, semi-trucks with machine guns, and followers who can do all of that for you. Similarly, progression tokens are handed out like candy on Halloween and are as easy to find as a few minutes of walking. Even the weapons of the game remind the player that this isn't a struggle for survival or a fight against the odds. With things like rocket-propelled shovels and some kind of magical infinite power pulse cannon, Far Cry 5 is begging the player not to take the story or even the game itself seriously, so why should we? Now, that's not to say that progression and perks cannot be implemented in a serious game. Far Cry 3 sets a good example. The progression system in this game is not based on finding tokens, but instead on actual mission progression or free roaming activities, such as hunting and plant collecting. The progression serves to illustrate the protagonist's changing role from naive college party kid to a fighter among the native people on the island. The perks are not too outlandish and can be interpreted to reflect a natural acquiring of abilities as one becomes more familiar with the various aspects of horticulture or hunting or hand-to-hand combat or even shooting. Just like in real life, as someone trains more in the martial arts, they learn new ways to incapacitate opponents. As a shooter spends more time at the range, they learn to control their breathing. As a young hunter spends more time cleaning the game he kills, he becomes more skilled at salvaging more useful components for consumption or working. However, Far Cry 5 takes the opposite approach. It's possible to acquire new abilities in shooting without even ever firing a bullet. Simply walk around and find the prepper stashes and spend the tokens on combat before you've even shot something. While these points are enough to push Far Cry 5 to the bottom of our list of favorite Far Cry games, we don't want to leave out all the things Far Cry 5 does well. There is no arguing the game is gorgeous. The setting of the mountain valley and the American interior complements the technical advancements of the enhanced Dunia engine very nicely. The dynamic lighting is gorgeous, the frame rate is buttery smooth, and the ambient sound effects really enhance the atmosphere. Similarly, the gunplay makes combat thoroughly enjoyable. Everything about shooting in this game makes it genuinely fun. The guns handle well, the sounds are satisfying, and the cover and melee mechanics really round out the combat experience. Weapons aside, the addition of fishing is a long-requested mechanic to open-world games, and certainly ties in with the setting of Montana. The downside here is that there is absolutely no reason to fish, except for money earning or simple enjoyment. Far Cry 5 missed an opportunity to make fishing a useful mechanic with some regard to crafting or enhancement syringes, and because of this, we played through the entire game almost without touching fishing at all. We just tried it once to make sure that we had simply experienced the new mechanic. On the topic of new additions, planes and helicopters are well intended, if ignoring their impact on the story and isolation motif mentioned earlier. Assuming for a moment we aren't talking about a Far Cry game, the planes and helicopters are fun to use. Seaplanes with machine guns and bombs are hard to not enjoy messing around with. However, their actual controls and handling leave a lot to be desired for those who have played pretty much any other game with aircraft. Driving cars, however, has certainly improved from the Far Cry 2 days, and the landscape makes going for scenic drives an enjoyable pastime. Again, ignoring their impact on the tone of the game, barging into camps with a semi-truck blasting twin-mounted M60s will never not be entertaining, and is certainly our preferred method for destroying pretty much anything. While the new and upgraded vehicles, weapon systems, and graphics are admirable for the game, how they affect the overall tone of the Far Cry series is what we call into question. But before we conclude our analysis, we need to discuss the nuke in the room, Far Cry 5's ending. There are many different ways that the story of Far Cry 5 can come to a close. There's the secret ending, which can be obtained at the very start of the game. However, calling it a secret is a bit of a stretch, considering Far Cry 4 already established the wait and do nothing method as an option to end the game early. In this outcome, the Rook and Sheriff walk away from Joseph Seed to leave their cult alone, while the Marshal threatens to arrest them both. The remaining two endings are up to the player's choice in the final cutscene of the normal gameplay. These are referred to as the Resist and the Walk Away endings. Should you choose to simply walk away and take the offer Joseph presents you, the Rook, the Sheriff, and the deputies all simply leave Hope County. Your other friends that you encountered along the way have all been brainwashed, so they're left behind. In this ending cutscene, the Sheriff, the Rook, and the remaining deputies drive off in their truck claiming that they will head to the nearest big town to call in the National Guard, which should have been done in the first place and is perhaps one of the biggest reasons why the entire plot of this game seems nonsensical. However, the Sheriff turns on the radio while driving and the song Only You plays. During the course of the game, the Rook becomes brainwashed to this song by Jacob Seed to basically kill everything in front of him. The screen flushes a red color and then fades, so presumably the Rook was sent into a homicidal spree and killed everyone in the car, thereby essentially leaving the cult to run amok and the more long-term consequences essentially left hanging. The final option, the one that we chose for our gameplay, known as the Resist choice, sees the Rook attempt to complete his mission by bringing Joseph Seed to justice. A fight ensues and the Rook's brainwashed friends all turn against him during the boss fight. The player must revive their brainwashed teammates to bring them back to their side. Once Joseph is defeated, another cutscene plays which sees the sheriff arrest Joseph Seed. However, as soon as this happens, a nuclear explosion detonates in one of the hills in the background. Attempting to flee from the blast, the Rook and his remaining friends, along with the now captured Joseph Seed, drive towards the bunker where the start of the game took place. However, a falling tree causes their car to crash and leaves only the Rook and Joseph Seed alive. Much like before, Joseph is now freed thanks to the wreck and drags the Rook into the bunker where he then kills Dutch, the bunker owner and initial friend of the Rook. In the final moments of this ending, Joseph announces that he was right about the coming apocalypse, and that he and the Rook will walk into God's new world together. This ending, which most consider to be the good ending to the game, has a bit of backstory. After Hope County has been purged of Faith, Jacob, and John, but not Joseph, news broadcasts can be heard in the car radios, which discuss the changing climate of the outside world. Once again, how Hope County had a local radio station running that received outside news reports but wasn't able to get a message out is ridiculous, but I digress. These news reports discuss the rapidly failing relationships between the US, North Korea, and Russia, and that the US was put on high alert for nuclear attacks. While these broadcasts never tell us who fired first, the point is ultimately moot. Nuclear Armageddon has come, and Joseph Seed was in fact right in his prediction that the end was near. None of these outcomes really tie everything together nicely, do they? None of these really satisfy our desire for the good guy to prevail, for the villain to be put behind bars, and for the world to be saved. For us, the endings to the game were perhaps the best part of the entire story, and to be quite honest, redeemed the plot from being completely unremarkable. The fact that Ubisoft went with endings which contradicted nearly all expectations and desires is intriguing and really paints the events of the game in a different light. These endings are all compelling and intriguing on their own, but when compared to the events leading up to them, the entirety of the plot still seems very outrageous, especially for a Far Cry game, which finally brings us to the conclusion we hinted at in the very beginning of the video. Far Cry 5 does not belong in the Far Cry series, at least from a longtime fan's perspective. The game completely lost touch with the sense of isolation, struggle, and grounded protagonists that are central to the stories the earlier games tell. Under any other title, Far Cry 5 would certainly be hailed as a fun and wacky sandbox action game along the lines of Grand Theft Auto, and might even make it among the high-ranking members of that genre. However, Ubisoft chose to publish this game as a member of the Far Cry series. So for those of us expecting a story about adapting in the face of adversity, Far Cry 5 simply felt disappointing. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. That concludes our rundown of our thoughts surrounding Far Cry 5. This video certainly does not cover every aspect of the game. We would need a lot more time to do that. But we want to know your opinion on our analysis. Have you played Far Cry 5 and the others? How do you think they compare? Do you agree with our conclusion, or has Far Cry 5 simply changed the direction of the series and we're too focused on the past? What parts of Far Cry 5 do we miss out on discussing? Please let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. We thank you again for joining us today, and we encourage you to check out our other stuff. We have an immersive mod series for Fallout 4, as well as a modded roleplay of it. We will also be starting an immersive mod review series for Fallout New Vegas as well, so if you're interested in checking any of that out, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks so much for watching, and we hope you'll join the White Collar Players again soon.